The storm consumed the mountain highway with a ferocity that made the world feel fragile, as if one hard gust could wipe everything away. Evan Carter had driven this route countless times, usually grateful for the quiet that came with the long, winding road. But tonight, the darkness felt heavier, as though it carried a warning he couldn't yet decipher. He was rounding the sharpest bend when a faint flicker of red and blue pierced the rain. At first, he thought it was lightning until the pulse came again, weak but steady. Police lights had a rhythm. This one sounded like a dying heartbeat. He slowed, then braked hard when the overturned patrol car appeared in the beam of his headlights, crumpled beside the guardrail like a toy crushed underfoot. For several seconds, Ra-Atwan sat frozen hands gripping the wheel breath suspended between his lungs. He had promised himself he would never again run toward the kind of chaos he used to live in. But promises meant little when someone was bleeding in the dark. He threw open the door and sprinted down the embankment, boots slipping against mud and wet pine needles. The stench of gasoline bit sharply through the cold air. Smoke curled from the hood of the wreck, faint but threatening. As he reached the shattered driver's side window, he lifted his flashlight and felt his chest constrict. A young police officer lay slumped forward, blonde hair soaked with blood, her breath shallow and uneven. Officer Megan Hale. She looked so young it hurt to look at her. For a terrible moment he feared she was already gone. But then her lips moved, barely separating, as she fought for air. "Back up. They're not coming," she whispered. The weakness of her voice carried something more than pain. It carried fear, not of dying from the crash, but of someone or something still out there. He forced the crushed door open farther, ignoring the groan of bending metal, and leaned close. "Officer Hale, stay with me," he said, trying to anchor her drifting consciousness. "I'm going to get you out." Her eyes fluttered, searching his face as if trying to understand who he was. Rain ran down his cheeks and into her hair as he slid his knife through the mangled seatbelt. When the strap snapped, her body shifted and she cried out softly, the sound ripping through him more cleanly than any blade. He murmured reassurances without thinking, falling back into the voice he had used years ago on battlefields far from Oregon, a voice he thought he had buried for good. He eased her out through the window and lowered her carefully onto the wet ground. Her vest was torn, and beneath it a deep wound pulsed with frightening intensity. She was losing blood fast, too fast. She reached for him with trembling fingers, gripping his sleeve as if anchoring herself to the world. "If you run," she whispered, "they'll find you too." Evan stilled. That was not something a simple crash victim said. That was fear born from pursuit. Pursuit by the same kind of men who had once stolen everything from him. He pressed his hand firmly over the wound, feeling her pulse weakening beneath his palm. The rain beat against them in relentless waves, but for Evan, the world had narrowed to one decision: save her, or watch her die like Elise. He could not live through that again. He needed his old trauma kit, the one buried under a tarp in the back of his truck, the one he had kept even after abandoning the life that required it. He met her gaze and spoke with calm certainty. "You're not dying up here. Not tonight. I'm coming right back." Her fingers curled around his wrist, pleading, but he gently loosened her grip. Then he rose, sprinting through the storm toward his truck, no longer able to pretend he was just a delivery driver. The man he had been, the medic, the fighter, the survivor, was already awake. Evan reached the truck drenched and shaking, though not from the cold. His hands trembled with the familiar electricity of adrenaline, the same current that had once carried him across deserts, through crossfire, into chaos he'd sworn he would never revisit. When he yanked open the tailgate and pulled back the tarp, the old trauma kit lay exactly where it always had: metal case, dented latch, rusted at the corners, a relic of a life he'd tried to bury. He grabbed it and sprinted back toward the wreck boots, pounding against the soaked earth, breath slicing through his lungs like ice. The storm roared trees swaying wildly, but beneath the noise, he could already hear the officer's breathing growing thinner. When he slid back down the slope, Megan was still conscious, but barely. Her head lolled to the side, hair plastered against her cheek. Rain pooled around her shoulders, carried streaks of blood into the mud, and Evan knew time was grinding down fast. He knelt beside her and opened the metal case with a snap. Inside, everything was exactly as he had packed it 6 years ago. Hemostatic gauze clamps, bandages, the tools of a combat medic who had once been expected to keep people alive, while bullets chewed the air above him. His hands moved with a terrifying ease, as though they had been waiting all this time. "This is going to hurt," he said, voice stripped of hesitation. "Stay with me." She tried to nod, but her breath hitched. Evan pressed the gauze deep into the wound, and she gasped, fingers grasping helplessly at the fabric of his jacket. Pain rolled across her face in sharp waves, but beneath it flickered something like determination. She was fighting to stay awake, fighting to hold on to the voice grounding her in the darkness. He kept talking to her steady and low, counting out breaths, guiding her through each surge of pain. It was the same tone he had once used to keep wounded soldiers conscious long enough to evacuate them. She responded like they had, clinging to the sound of certainty. When the bleeding finally slowed, Evan wrapped the wound tightly, his movements swift, precise, practiced. But her pulse was still frighteningly weak. They needed to get off the mountain. And there was still no signal. Megan swallowed hard, her voice a fragile thread. "You're not just a driver." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everything about the way he moved betrayed him. She drew a shaky breath. "You know, what you're doing." "Focus," he said quietly. "You can ask questions when you're not dying." But her eyes stayed locked on him, studying the discipline in his posture, the steadiness in his hands, the strange calm he carried in the midst of catastrophe. She recognized a trained mind, a trained body, a trained past. Thunder cracked above them, and she flinched instinctively, curling inward. That reaction told him more than her words ever could. "They forced me off the road," she whispered. "Black SUV, Oregon plates scratched off. Men with masks. They didn't care if I lived." He inhaled sharply. He knew the type. He knew the methods. He knew the darkness in those kinds of eyes because he had once stared back into them on another continent. His jaw tightened. "You followed them," he said. She gave a weak nod. "They've been trafficking through Bend. Thought I had a lead. Thought I was close. I was stupid." "You weren't stupid," he said more sharply than he intended. "You were doing your job." Her breathing stuttered, and Evan realized they were losing time. He needed to move her. He slipped one arm beneath her knees and another behind her back. The moment he lifted her, she cried out, her face tightening as the pain slammed through her body. He held her closer, trying to steady the jostling as he climbed back up the embankment, each step a battle against mud and gravity. "You have to keep talking," he said, voice strained with the effort. "Say your name." "Megan Hale." "Good. Keep going." She tried, but her voice faded as they reached the roadside, her head dropping heavily against his shoulder. He forced himself forward, the weight of her body growing heavier with every step toward the truck. His muscles burned, but he pushed through. Halfway there, she murmured against his collarbone, barely audible. "Why are you helping me?" "Like this," he didn't answer immediately. The truth was too raw, too tangled with memories he couldn't yet name without unraveling. When he finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper carried on the storm. "Because no one helped my wife." The words hit the air like a confession, but Megan was already slipping back into unconsciousness. Evan tightened his grip, jaw set, heart pounding with renewed urgency. Tonight, he wouldn't let history repeat itself. Tonight, he would not fail. Evan yanked open the passenger door and laid Megan across the seat as gently as the rain-soaked chaos allowed. Her skin was cold beneath his fingertips, the kind of cold that crept inward from shock, not weather. He draped his jacket over her, wiped the rain from her face, and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. The pulse fluttered weakly, a failing rhythm he'd felt too many times in places where backup never came. He slammed the door and ran around to the driver's side, his breath fogging the glass as he climbed in. The storm swallowed everything outside. Trees bent beneath the wind, and the road ahead looked like a narrow ribbon of danger. But the truck started with a rough growl, and Evan gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles paled. He had only one goal: now get her to help before the darkness claimed her. Megan stirred as he accelerated, her voice a faint scrape. They'll follow. They always finish what they start. He glanced at her, the dashboard lights casting shadows across her trembling features. Not tonight. You're safe in here. But she gave a barely perceptible shake of her head, as if she knew something he didn't, as if she had seen a ruthlessness that didn't relent just because a uniform hit the ground. Evan's jaw tightened. He drove faster tires slicing through standing water. The mountains loomed around them, silhouettes swallowed by the storm. Every few seconds he checked her breathing, counting the seconds between each shallow inhale. Too slow, too fragile. She needed warmth, blood, and lights. She could focus on anything that would anchor her. I tried calling for backup, she whispered. No one came. Her voice cracked. I thought I was already dead. Evan felt something twist deep in his chest, a reminder of Elise's final moments on a roadside, very much like this one. You're alive, he said. And you're not dying in my truck. The words came out harder than he intended, but she didn't seem to mind. Her eyes were half-lidded, searching his face with a strange, quiet recognition. You talk like someone who's lost people. He didn't respond. The storm howled around them, and the wipers struggled to push away the flood on the windshield. A fallen pine branch forced him to swerve sharply, and Megan gasped at the sudden motion. He steadied the truck, steadied himself, and forced his breathing into something even. He needed to think, not feel. Feelings got people killed. Logic saved them. They had roughly 20 miles before Ben. Under normal conditions, 20 miles was nothing. Tonight it felt like an entire country. He kept going. After several minutes of silence, broken only by the storm, Megan whispered, "Why did you stop? Most people wouldn't." The question lingered between them, heavy and unavoidable. Evan kept his eyes on the road. Because someone once needed me to stop, and I didn't get there in time. She understood instantly. Even in her fading state, she recognized the hollow edge of guilt sharpened by years of memory. She reached weakly for the center console, fingers brushing the empty air before falling back to her side. "I'm sorry," she murmured. He swallowed. He hated hearing that phrase. Death didn't care about sorrow. The truck rounded another curve, and Evan slowed. He knew this stretch of forest too well. This was where cell service returned sometimes. He grabbed his phone, one hand still gripping the wheel. A single flicker of signal appeared, vanished, and then flickered again. He hit 911. Static, then a faint ringing. When the dispatcher answered, he shouted over the storm, giving his location, her injuries, everything they needed. Help was on the way, but mountain rescue could take 20 minutes. Too long for someone losing blood by the pint. He hung up and reached across to adjust the bandage, feeling the warmth beneath his palm. Too warm. The bleeding was trying to break through again. Megan winced, but didn't complain. "You're not just a medic," she whispered, blinking slowly. "You move like someone trained to kill, not just save." The observation struck him with more force than the storm outside. He didn't answer. Couldn't. She exhaled shakily. "Who were you?" Evans shifted gears, eyes still locked on the serpentine road ahead. "Someone I'm not anymore." But even as he said it, he knew the storm, the blood, and the instinct gripping his body told another truth. The man he'd buried was clawing his way back to the surface, summoned not by violence, but by duty. By failure he refused to repeat. Megan's breathing faltered again, pulling him from the thought. He pressed harder on the gas, determination burning into focus. "Stay awake," he said. "Tell me something." She blinked slowly, fighting the fog creeping over her mind. "Like what? Anything. Talk about why you became a cop." She gave a faint, pained laugh. "Wanted to make the world less awful." Her voice thinned. Didn't realize how deep the awful goes. Evan glanced at her again. Her eyes were closing. Too soon. Too dangerous. "Hey, look at me." Her lashes fluttered just barely. "I've seen worse," he said, voice low, steady, commanding. "You're not dying in this storm." For a moment she believed him. Enough to breathe. Enough to hold on. And as the faint lights of Bend finally began to glow through the rain-soaked darkness, Evan Carter realized something he had tried to deny for 6 long years. No matter how far he ran, he could never escape who he truly was. A protector, a fighter, a man built for moments exactly like this. And tonight, that man was back. Evan braked hard as the clearing near the old mill came into view, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. Emergency strobes flashed ahead, casting frantic strokes of red across the flooded dirt. The moment the truck skidded to a halt, paramedics were already sprinting toward them, boots splashing in the rising water. Evan jumped out and yanked open the passenger door. But the sight of Megan's stillness hit him like a blow. Her head had tilted to the side, eyes half closed, breath trembling in uneven threads. He touched her neck there, faint but present. The relief was sharp enough to hurt. The paramedics surrounded him within seconds. One leaned into the truck and froze. "Who did this field dressing?" he demanded, disbelief clear in his voice. Evan didn't answer. He stepped aside as they expertly transferred Megan onto a stretcher, securing her IV, checking her vitals. But their murmurs carried. Whoever patched her saved her life. This is military work. He knew he should walk away, disappear into the shadows, but his feet stayed planted. He watched as they pushed the stretcher toward the ambulance, the rain pouring down so heavily it blurred the world into streaks of color. A police cruiser pulled up sharply, and Captain Ronald Briggs stepped out, coat whipping in the storm. Thick-set, weathered by years on the force, he surveyed the scene with an intensity that made other officers straighten unconsciously. His gaze locked on Evan, sizing him up with a single sweep, drenched clothes, mud-stained boots, the fatigue in his shoulders, the strange steadiness in his eyes. Briggs approached with the authority of someone who expected answers. "You the one who found her?" he asked. Evan nodded. "And you pulled her out?" Another nod. Briggs studied the overturned patrol car, still smoking in the distance. Then the paramedics working through the rain. "What exactly were you doing on this road?" Evan tightened his jaw. "Driving home." Briggs didn't look convinced, not with how efficiently Evan had acted, not with the kind of wound Megan had. "Most people don't jump into a wreck like that," the captain said. "Most people freeze." Aaron's breath clouded the air. I'm not most people. Briggs's eyes sharpened, recognizing something beneath the surface discipline training history. Where did you learn trauma care like that? He pressed. Evan hesitated, rain dripping from his hair, his silence revealing more than words ever could. The captain seemed to file that away. We're going to need a statement, he said. You might have seen something the rest of us missed. But Evan barely heard him. His focus was on the ambulance, where paramedics worked frantically over Megan. The doors stood open, lights spilling into the storm as they stabilized her for transport. One medic called over the radio, BP is holding. She's still with us. Still with us. The words hit harder than expected. Elise hadn't been still with us. Elise had slipped away before anyone reached her. Maybe that was why Evan couldn't walk off this scene, why he stood there, drenched, fists clenched at his sides. Saving Megan felt like saving a fraction of what he had lost. Finally, the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped away toward the hospital. Briggs watched it disappear, then turned back to Evan. You're coming with us? He said, not an arrest, but a mandate. Evan let out a long breath. My daughter's waiting at home. Briggs didn't flinch. We'll make it quick. Evan almost laughed at that. Nothing about tonight had been quick. Everything had pulled him deeper, dragging the past he'd tried to bury back into the open. 2 officers escorted him toward a cruiser, though not forcefully. They didn't touch him. Something about him made them keep a respectful distance. Evan slid into the back seat without argument, watching rain race down the window like fragments of memory. He could still feel Megan's fading pulse beneath his fingertips. He could still hear her whispered warning, they'll find you too. The storm outside raged, but inside the cruiser, the world felt eerily still. Briggs climbed into the front seat, turned and studied Evan through the mesh divider. You saved her life tonight, he said, almost reluctantly. But I need to know how. Evan didn't respond. He gazed at the streaks of rain sliding down the window, the quiet hum of the engine filling the silence. He didn't want this attention, didn't want questions, didn't want old ghosts clawing back into daylight. But it was too late. Tonight had already stripped away the life he'd tried to build piece by piece. And as the cruiser pulled away from the storm-lit clearing, Evan sensed that everything ahead, every question, every revelation was going to drag him straight back into the world he'd sworn he would never enter again. The cruiser rolled through the flooded streets, wipers beating back the storm, as Captain Briggs watched Evan in the rearview mirror, with the sharp, dissecting look of a man who'd spent 30 years reading criminals, liars, and ghosts. Evan met none of the categories cleanly, and that made Briggs uneasy. When they turned into the Bend Police Department parking lot, the captain stepped out first and motioned for Evan to follow. Rain dripped from the brim of Briggs's hat as he led him inside, exchanging brief nods with officers who whispered to each other the moment he passed. News of Megan's condition had already spread. Rescued, stabilized against all odds, still alive. And they knew the stranger standing beside their captain had something to do with it. Inside the station, Briggs guided him into a small interview room. No cuffs, no threats. Just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the steady drip of water from Evan's soaked jacket. Briggs sat opposite him, elbows on the table, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Start from the beginning, he said. Tell me how you found her. Evan recounted the mountain pass, the overturned patrol car, the gasoline, the wound. He kept it clinical, simple. But Briggs's expression shifted when Evan described the field work he'd done to save her. Too efficient, too advanced, too practiced. You're not telling me everything the captain said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Evan leaned back, eyes steady. I told you enough. Briggs exhaled, studying him. My paramedics said your work was better than half the military medics they've met. Evan didn't answer. So I checked your name. Briggs continued tone sharpening. Evan Carter, 39, delivery driver, no criminal record, but also no employment history for nearly a decade before you moved here. No paper trail, nothing. Evan felt his jaw tighten slightly. He'd been careful. He thought he had buried the past more completely than this. Briggs leaned forward. People don't disappear for 10 years unless they're running from something or someone. Evan held his gaze unmoving. The captain paused, trying a different angle. Megan said something before she passed out. She said you moved like someone who'd seen combat. Evan didn't react. Briggs continued anyway, and you handled that wound like you'd treated them before. Under pressure, under fire. Silence, heavy, dense. Briggs's voice dropped. I think you were military something high level. Something they keep off record. Evan's eyes flickered the smallest slip, but for a seasoned captain, it was enough. Briggs leaned back as if pieces finally clicked together. I'm not here to expose you, he said. But I need the truth. Because the thing that ran Megan off that road, it's bigger than she realized. And you knew that the moment she said cartel. That word cracked the air open. The memory of Elise's last day hit Evan with a cold, merciless weight. A call for backup that never reached anyone. A wrecked highway just like tonight. His hands tightened in his lap. Briggs saw it. They killed someone you loved, the captain said quietly. Didn't they? Evan's throat tightened, but he didn't speak. He didn't have to. The truth was carved into the hollows of his face. Briggs continued. They're operating in Bend again. Expanding. Smarter. More organized. Megan got too close and paid the price. His voice hardened. We're outgunned. We're undertrained. And someone on my force may be feeding them information. Evan finally looked up. Briggs held the gaze without flinching. We need someone who knows how these bastards think. Someone who's been where they are. Someone who can help us fight back before more of my officers end up in body bags. For a long moment, Evan said nothing. The room felt painfully small, the memories too loud. He had spent 6 years avoiding this exact request. 6 years building a life meant to protect his daughter from the man he used to be. No, Evan said at last. I can't go back to that world. Briggs didn't argue. Instead, he stood and walked to the door, pausing only long enough to say, if we don't stop them now, they'll come for Megan again. And others. Maybe someone else's wife. Someone else's child. The door closed behind him. Leaving Evan alone with the one truth he could not outrun, he could walk away from the station, but not from the war already rising at his doorstep. Captain Briggs left Evan alone only for a few minutes, but the silence felt longer, stretched thin by memories he had fought to bury. The storm outside had softened to a distant rumble, yet somehow the quiet inside the interview room roared even louder. Evan sat still, elbows on his knees, fingers interlocked so tightly his knuckles whitened. He had walked away from battlefields soaked in dust and blood, from the ruins of the life he once shared with Elise. But tonight had dragged every ghost back into the light. And he knew it wasn't over. The door creaked open again, and 2 figures stepped inside, Detective Laura Jensen and Detective Cole Ramirez. Both were younger than the captain, but their postures carried the weariness of people who had seen more than their share of darkness. Laura, sharp-eyed and steady, set a tablet on the table, while Ramirez leaned against the wall, arms crossed, studying Evan with cautious curiosity. We have follow-up questions, Laura said. Her voice was even, but not cold. Professional. Captain Briggs said you were the one who stabilized Officer Hale. Evan nodded. I did what I could. What you did was more than that, Ramirez said. Every EMT we talked to said you bought her at least 40 minutes she didn't have. Evan didn't respond. Praise felt wrong, heavy, unwanted. Laura tapped the tablet. We also pulled your public file. She slid it toward him, though he didn't look. It's clean. Too clean. No previous employment records until you moved to Bend 6 years ago. No medical certifications. No military records. She paused, holding his gaze. But your hands. Your technique. That wasn't learned from a YouTube video. Ramirez spoke next, softer but sharper. Who were you before this quiet life? Because someone with your instincts doesn't just fade into a delivery truck job in Central Oregon. Evan stayed silent. He wasn't ready to let strangers into the bloody history he had fought to keep from his daughter. But Laura continued anyway, her tone shifting. We're not your enemies, Evan. He stiffened slightly. They had used his first name. Not Sir. Not Carter. Evan. Laura took a breath. We need to talk about Megan's case. The room seemed to constrict around him. Megan was following a cartel trail, she said. A warehouse off the West Interstate. She was onto something. Then she was forced off the road. Someone knew she was alone. Someone on the inside, Ramirez added. Her route was supposed to be confidential. Last-minute shift change. Only a handful of people knew about it. Evan felt an old familiar tension coil through his muscles, the instinct to start analyzing patterns, exits, motives, angles. He forced himself to stay still. Laura studied him. She told you something, didn't she? Something before she passed out. Evan considered lying. It would be easier, cleaner, safer. But the memory of Megan's trembling voice refused to leave him. She said they'd come back, he murmured. That they finish what they start. Both detectives exchanged a glance. A troubled one. Ramirez spoke quietly. Then we don't have long. Laura folded her hands. We need help, Evan. Captain Briggs believes you have experience we don't. Experience that can save lives. Evan leaned back, eyes hardening. I'm not a cop. I'm not a soldier anymore. I have a daughter. I'm not risking her for a fight that isn't mine. Laura's expression softened. We know about Elise. His breath stopped. Ramirez lifted a file. Her case was never officially closed. We know she was killed in a cartel ambush. We know you left the military 2 months after that. And we know why. Evan's jaw clenched, but he forced his voice steady. Don't talk about my wife. Laura nodded. We're not here to reopen old wounds. But Elise's case is connected. The same cartel Megan was investigating. This is the same organization that killed your wife. The world seemed to tilt. For years, Evan had shoved the truth aside, choosing denial over fury. But hearing it spoken aloud, clean, cold, indisputable, sent heat crawling under his skin. They've expanded, Ramirez said. Better weapons, better training. Someone with military knowledge is helping them. That's why Megan never stood a chance. Evan stared at the table pulse, pounding a war rising inside him. He had spent 6 years trying to protect Lucy by avoiding violence, building a quiet life where danger couldn't reach her. But danger had found them anyway. Found Bend. Found Megan. Found him. Laura leaned forward. We're not asking you to carry a badge. We're asking you to help us understand how these people think. How they fight. How they move. You won't go into the field. Not unless you choose to. Just consult, train, guide. Keep our officers alive. Ramirez added, if we fail, Megan won't be the last casualty. You know that. Silence spread through the room, heavy and suffocating. Evan saw Elise's face, her smile, her last breath, echoed in his memory like a wound that never closed. He saw Megan bleeding in the rain, telling him they were coming. He saw Lucy waiting at home, blissfully unaware that the world was closing in again. He lifted his eyes, resolve settling into place like armor he thought he had abandoned. "I'll consult," he said quietly. "No field duty, no weapons. I analyzed the plans. Nothing more." Laura nodded slowly. Ramirez exhaled in relief. But Evan continued, voice firm. "And if I say something is too dangerous, you listen." They both nodded. Yet beneath their relief, Evan sensed something heavier, like they knew the agreement he just made would pull him deeper into this war than he ever intended. And the worst part was the sinking feeling blooming in his chest. He already knew it too. Training began before dawn, 3 days later, long before the station filled with the usual noise of ringing phones, clattering keyboards, and officers trading stories over burnt coffee. Evan stood alone in the dimly lit tactical room, arms crossed, studying the whiteboard where someone had sketched a rough layout of the cartel's suspected warehouse. He wasn't supposed to be here this early, but sleep had become an unwelcome stranger since the night he pulled Megan from the wreck. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elise. Then Megan. Then the faceless men who kept returning to Bend like a plague that refused to die. The door swung open, and the first group of officers filed in, young, eager, too green to understand how quickly a routine raid could turn into a massacre. Captain Briggs joined them, nodding once at Evan, before stepping aside silently, giving him the floor. Some officers recognized him as the stranger who rescued Megan, but their expressions carried doubt. A delivery driver, a civilian. What could he teach them about staying alive? Evan felt their skepticism and embraced it. Underestimation was a familiar cloak, one he had worn long before Bend. He began without ceremony. Most of you think tactical medicine is just bandages and pressure. It's not. It's the difference between going home and bleeding out on the floor of a warehouse. His voice was steady-clipped, commanding in a way that surprised even him. He demonstrated tourniquet placement, wound packing, airway management. The officers watched him carve through each lesson with precision sharpened by years of battlefield repetition. As minutes turned to hours, doubt faded. Respect settled in its place. Megan arrived halfway through the session, moving slowly but determined, her abdomen wrapped beneath her plain clothes. When she caught Evan's eye, there was no gratitude in her expression, only something steadier, deeper. Recognition. She took a seat up front, listening as though her life depended on every word. Perhaps it did. After the training, Briggs led Evan into the mobile command room, parked behind the station. Inside screens displayed live surveillance of the warehouse Megan had been investigating before her crash. Officers buzzed around them, preparing for the evening raid. Evan studied the layout with a soldier's eye, tracing possible escape routes, choke points, and ambush angles. Briggs pointed at the rear exit. "Team 3 will cover this door." "No," Evan said, immediate and certain. "That door will be wired. They'll expect a flank. Keep Team 3 back 20 yards. He tapped the schematic marking a narrow corridor. "This is where they'll funnel their runners." Briggs frowned. "How do you know?" Evan's answer was quiet. "Because it's what I'd do." The captain didn't question him again. As dusk settled and officers prepared to move out, Megan approached him. Her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "You're saving more people than you realize." He wanted to disagree, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, she added, "You'll be riding with us tonight, right in the command vehicle." Evan hesitated, feeling the tugs of an old world he had sworn never to re-enter. But the decision was no longer his to resist. Lives depended on him now. Briggs, Megan, an entire team walking straight into the mouth of danger. He finally nodded. And as the convoy engines roared to life, Evan Carter understood something with absolute clarity. He was no longer standing at the edge of the fight. He had already stepped into it. The convoy settled into position beneath a moonless sky, engines rumbling low as officers spread across the perimeter like dark shadows preparing to strike. Inside the mobile command vehicle, the glow of monitors lit Evan's face in sharp angles. He wasn't supposed to feel this familiar thrill, the cold focus before an operation. But it pulsed through him anyway, unstoppable now that he'd stepped back into the world he once walked away from. Captain Briggs stood behind him, arms folded tightly, while Megan sat at the communications desk, headphones pressed to her ears. She looked steadier than she had any right to look after surviving an attempted murder only days earlier. But her eyes held the same fierce resolve he'd seen on the mountain road. She would not let the men who tried to kill her hide in the dark. Teams 1 and 2 in position, a voice crackled over the comms. Evan leaned closer to the monitors, scanning every angle of the warehouse's dimly lit exterior. The old structure sagged under its own weight, but the darkness around it felt alive with danger. "Move," Briggs ordered. Flashbangs erupted, lighting the ground in brief starbursts as officers surged forward. Radio chatter flooded the command vehicle, clear rooms, suspects tackled, gunfire exchanged. But all of it blunted into background noise as Evan focused on the screen showing the rear of the warehouse. Movement. A shadow darting toward the back exit. Evan recognized the pattern instantly, the low stance, the purposeful speed. Someone trained. Someone confident. He snatched the microphone. "Team 3, freeze. Do not approach the back door." "It's rigged. Pull back 20 yards. Confusion rippled across the comms, but Team 3 halted just as the back door burst open, and Vargas Soto emerged clutching a detonator. Even in the grainy camera feed, Evan could see the wild determination in Vargas's eyes. He was ready to bring the entire warehouse down with everyone inside. Megan's voice sliced through the chaos. "Captain, I have eyes on Vargas." She steadied her rifle, breath tight, injury forgotten. Evan felt his pulse spike. "Megan, don't let him reach the corner. There's a pressure charge wired to the frame." She didn't hesitate. One measured breath, one controlled squeeze of the trigger. Vargas dropped before he could lift his hand. The detonator hit the ground and rolled harmlessly into the mud. The command vehicle erupted in relieved exclamations. Briggs let out a long exhale. That could have killed all of them. Evan didn't answer. He felt pride, but also dread. This was only one cell, one leader. The war ran deeper. Back at the station, applause broke out when he entered the briefing room. Officers he'd trained approached him with gratitude etched across their exhausted faces. Megan stepped forward last, placing a small engraved plaque in his hand. "You kept us alive tonight," she said softly. "All of us." He tried to hand it back. "I'm not doing this for recognition." "I know," she replied. "That's why you should keep it." Briggs joined them. "We need you, Carter. Not as a soldier, as the man who sees what we can't." Evan looked around at the battered but living officers, Megan's steady gaze, and the ghost of Elisa's smile in the back of his mind. He'd promised himself he would not return to war, but maybe this wasn't war. Maybe it was healing. "I'll keep training your people," he said quietly. "But that's it." Weeks later, Evan stood in a small community classroom with a medical dummy before him. Lucy in the front row, Megan leaning against the back wall. A handwritten sign read, "Carter First Response Training." This, he realized, was where his fight truly belonged, not in destroying lives, but in saving them. In the end, Evan's journey reminds us of a truth often overlooked: real strength rarely comes from the desire to fight, but from the courage to protect. Experts in trauma psychology often note that people who have walked through darkness carry a unique ability to lead others back toward the light. Evan embodies that resilience. He teaches us that redemption isn't loud, it's consistent, patient, and built on choices that put humanity first. If this story moved you or made you reflect on what courage truly looks like, consider liking and subscribing, so more people can discover narratives that honor quiet heroes like him. And before you go, drop a short comment, just 2 or 3 words, to tell us what you think defines a real protector. Suggested phrase: stand strong.